polytheism is not literalist in that sense. I mean, they weren't people that, I mean, there was aspects where they would sort of discuss it as such, but the idea of the mythologies being literal representations of deities was not a common view uh, at all. I mean, it was ultimately viewed as symbolic. They did believe that they had essence and that they were entities that existed and were worthy of veneration, but the mythologies were never literally interpreted in that sense, if that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, I guess from a Westerner who was raised in a Christian tradition, uh, a fundamental Christian tradition where you do take text and stories about gods literally. Um, like when I read the Iliad, I, I guess this literally happened in that these gods literally did these things and said these things to each other. But that's, I guess, because of my upbringing that I interpret it through that lens.
Understood. Welcome, Cornelius.
Hey, what's up, guys?
Not a whole lot. Jordan was just asking me some questions about what I practice. And I was clarifying some elements of historical practice and how it made sense to earlier cultures, or some of the ways it made sense for earlier cultures. There is ambiguity.
Kevin, are you a student of the language as well, either the ancient or the modern?
I'm learning as much as I can about the languages. I would not say that I'm anywhere close to being fluent in the languages or even semi-fluent. So I really have more of a lexical understanding of it, terminologies and how it made sense, and particularly as it refers to my spiritual practice. But I'm improving that, largely through the lens of modern Greek and kind of working backwards. But I'm hoping to sort of take it also from the other end and starting from the base of Attic Greek and then following that path as well. But they're difficult, and it's difficult languages, particularly for a Westerner who's not really all that familiar. But that's kind of a lifelong process when you're learning different languages, getting understandings of certain historical elements. So it's a gradual process. But I wouldn't necessarily call myself a linguist by any stretch. So does anyone have anything they'd like to discuss?
Not off the top of my head.
Okay.
I was really looking forward to this. I should have put more thought into what I wanted to bring, but
Well, it's not a potluck, so don't worry about it.
yeah. I had a heck of a Monday, and it has zapped my brain.
Understood.
I'm trying to remember a question I was going to ask you guys from last week's discussion, but I didn't write it down. So I thought about it about some one day last week, so I just forgot it from then to here. I'm just trying to remember what it was.
Okay.
Okay, I think I remember it. Um, would you follow the, or do you believe in the, I don't call it the ancient notion, but the notion that at least with the Greek gods that they weren't really directly influencing with human affairs, that they just did their own things compared to the other religions of today, that there's a direct relationship between the deity and humanity per se.
Well, there's a common thread throughout a lot of polytheistic religions that the gods ultimately have their own domains. Those domains ultimately interact, but the gods largely have their own agendas, their own methods, and the things that they deal with and that they interact with within nature, and that there's less of a propensity to view the gods as having literal or special interaction with humans. And oftentimes that view, particularly among Greek and Roman religion, would have been viewed as somewhat irrational or superstitious. An excess of devotion to a particular deity, a particular practice, or even a particular cultus would have been viewed as such. It would have been viewed as ultimately harmful. And oftentimes there was encouragement in these religions to have regular practice, to follow certain rituals, to make regular sacrifices, and especially within Greek religion, there was an encouragement to worship and honor as many deities as possible. Maybe not in the literal sense of it, but it was definitely a sort of overarching thematic element that you see present in the religion. That it was more valuable to one's spiritual growth and spiritual health to have a diversity of different practices, to have a flexibility of one's spiritual path. So, yeah, I would definitely say that there's less of an emphasis on how the gods necessarily interact with human beings, and less of and more of a focus, that is, on how the gods interact with the cosmos itself, and particularly with nature, because ultimately a lot of these early indigenous religions were very nature focused. It's part of the reason why a lot of modern neo-paganism has considered these different traditions to be earth-centered. It's a common buzzword that's used to describe the modern pagan movement.
Okay. That was the thing I was wondering about at least last week. 'Cause I was wondering if that at least the notion had changed, but it seems like it's pretty much constant that the gods have their own affairs and we have our own. It's like it doesn't cross in between.
Well, and kind of it's important to understand that there's a common mindset that, I mean, obviously it is beneficial and something to explore, having relationships, having devotions to the gods in these ancient religions. Um, but it's more of a thing that the person themselves, through these practices, through regular practice, they grow as a person, and it's the sort of concept that in so doing, we better understand the ways in which the gods interact with the cosmos. That was kind of the general theme of these things. It was far less narrow in focus, and it was much broader in focus than perhaps many people in modern religions are afforded or used to or familiar with. That is.
Okay.
Welcome, Brother John.
Good to see you, Brother John.
I'd say Cornelius, who's like I guess a bit more of a living understanding of how these things work. And I think it's important to realize that there are different philosophies and there are differences within cultures. But a good way to look into this would be to look at two different modern religions that are so practiced, particularly Hinduism, but also Shintoism, which is the traditional indigenous polytheistic religion of Japan. And you see a lot of these elements that I've kind of brought up about Greek religion, and that some of the other people who have attended have brought out about Norse religions and Celtic religions. and Egyptian religions. They're present in these beliefs because there's ultimately a fundamental similarity between the worldview, the more cosmic and cyclical worldviews that you typically see among polytheism. Whether that polytheism is mitigated like a sort of henotheism or monism, or if it's a very literal or a separate kind of polytheism that typically in a lot of pagan movements would be called hard polytheism. Soft polytheism, in contrast, would be more monistic or henotheistic in character. So you're familiar.
Okay, yeah, those are two religions I'm not really that familiar with. Besides knowing that they exist and where they are, I'm not really aware of their practices and whatnot.
Yeah. Well, you see a lot of the elements and a lot of the themes in those religions, despite being very different and distant, literally in distance, from a lot of the ones that we've often discussed and brought up in the West. There's a lot of these very fundamental similarities. So I think if you look at these, and oftentimes you can actually see videos of these practices, you can see documented cases of its practice, you can see people describing it in detail and how it's still practiced, and particularly how it's practiced now in the modern day, can help to give you a really good understanding. And a lot of people within the sort of traditions that I've followed, the reconstructed kind of traditions that I follow, often take example from these groups because it gives us a clear example of how it works now, living in 2015.
Okay.
Kevin, what kind of readings do you do, and are they like how much are they part of your religious practice? Like reading the Bible would be to a Christian.
It's fair to say that our religion is doctrinal, but it's not dogmatic. It's not a creedal religion. It's not orthodox. There are general beliefs, there are general principles that are a part of the religion, and ultimately ones that are culturally specific to ancient Greece. But there are no commandments of faith in the same sense that you would see among Christianity. Largely the myths are viewed from more of a philosophical lens, something that one studies to grow personally and to grow culturally as a part of your in-group, a part of your community. So they're definitely there for inspiration, and there are several which you can read. As far as the general creation myth, the most common one that you see is Hesiod's Theogony and Works and Days, which is an associated work, which goes more into local, rural kind of practices. But the actual theogony itself is one of the most common and well preserved mythologies as far as creation myths that we have present. But many people also take inspiration from the Iliad and the Odyssey. And there are various different writings about the ethics of the Greeks. You have the tenets of Solon, you have the golden verses of Pythagoras, and you have the 147 Delphic maxims, which are often used in inspiration. There are similar corollaries in people who practice Norse heathenry and or Satru using the Havamal, because those are ultimately ethical sayings, philosophical kind of insights that one would study to help to contemplate and meditate. And many polytheists spend a good amount of time meditating upon these sorts of ideas to help us to better understand these traditions. So I hope that sort of clarifies it for you a little bit.
Yeah, it does. I actually read the Havamal about 3 months ago. My brother-in-law is he's really into I don't know, just European history, like ancient, Norway and all that. And he introduced me to it. I'd never heard of the Havamal, but it was just kind of like a very short book of proverbs, and most of it was like how to behave when you visit someone's house and
hospitality to guests.
Exactly, yeah.
And it's not what I practice, but a number of my close friends actually do practice it. So I try to have a working understanding of how many of these things work. And that would definitely be something I would point to people to get a good understanding of the principles of a culture, particularly through ethics. And that was something that was very important for communal cultures, was how you deal with outsiders, and even not just outsiders as in your entire nation, but outsiders as in a person from another community, locally to you, another tribe, another kingdom, as it were. So that was definitely something in particular that was very important in Scandinavia. And you also find similarities to that among the ancient Greeks. The Greek culture was divided for most of its history. It was really not one Greece for most of its history. There were many different city-states. And oftentimes when I try to describe things to people, or sometimes when I'm trying to dispel certain misconceptions, understandable misconceptions, but misconceptions nonetheless, I have to explain to people that there are differences in different parts of ancient Greece. Uh, the most notable ones are the differences between Athenian and Spartan society. Athenian society would be more classically understood as being more patriarchal in influence. Women, for instance, were less likely to have their own property and to have more freedoms within society. But in Spartan society, women often owned property quite a bit, and often would also lead. And what was expected of men was very different than what was expected of men in Athens. And small practices that you see are perfect examples of this. For instance, in Athens, if you were a young boy, you would keep your hair long until you had a sort of coming of age ceremony, and they would cut your hair. This is largely where we get a lot of our ideas in modern day. You know, you take a kid in to get their hair cut at the barber. It's a very similar context that it had in ancient Greece and in Rome, largely where we get the idea from. But in Sparta, you kept your hair short when you were a boy, and you were allowed to grow out your hair and facial hair as you went into manhood. So you see these just very topical differences that echo into these much more nuanced and much more specific differences in government, in culture, and the ways gender and sexuality were viewed, among other things, particularly in the religion. There were different focuses, different gods had more influence or less influence, and were viewed differently depending on what city-state you were in. And I also think it's particularly valuable as far as the discussions of world religions. Oftentimes I bring this up when I speak to Christians. There's a lot of diversity in the history of Christianity. There are many different Christianities that were in existence in its early days. And in the entire span, and looking at 2,000 years of Christian history, there are many different ways in which it is manifested. There's over 1,000 different denominations of Christianity if you look at the whole broad span of the religion. And even within similar or affiliated denominations, there's differences. Look how many different forms of Protestantism there are. And a lot of these differences, when you really get down to it, come to cultural differences in ways in which things were adopted, the ways in which people were converted to certain religions, or they converted to said religion, but also how it was adopted into society, into politics, certain kingdoms, the writings of certain versions of the Bible. You have this all throughout, and this is a constant throughout the various religious cultures that have sprung out for thousands of years. And so when I see people sort of glazing over these differences, I sort of wonder where their resources are coming from. And it seems very lacking in a lot of discussions, and people just make a lot of assumptions when we have these discussions, and nobody wants to look at the histories behind them. I think that's it's quite a shame. So, Abram, you still there?
I am here.
Cool. So what are you up to? Is your download finished?
Yeah, it fixed it.
Oh, great. So you're using it mostly for book reading, the PDF viewer, or you're doing like more things like spreadsheets or manuals and things?
Character sheets.
No, that's particularly useful. I mean, a lot of times when I was doing tabletop stuff and I was helping run it, I go to Kinko's and get like multiple printouts of the various manuals. So I'm sure that'll help you out quite a bit, and you'll be able to send mass emails. I'd recommend, if you haven't already, you should probably start a group, like a Facebook group. Make it easier to host events and kind of get things started.
Yeah, we do news through Facebook, and we currently using Skype. We're probably going to move to Hangouts.
No, not a bad idea. I mean, it's a good platform. I mean, it can sometimes be hit or miss on certain things, but the platform generally is pretty stable. It's getting people to understand how to use the platform that can sometimes be the difficulty.
So I definitely see a lot of faces I'm unfamiliar with, I believe.
Well, Atrahasis has been in here a number of times, though not all the time. So I'm definitely familiar with him. We've discussed a few things on occasion, and Massad's been here the last couple times, so I'm definitely familiar with most people here. I'm trying to remember. John, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
Yeah, see, I spoke to you before.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I recognize your voice now.
Yeah, Gnostic.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. It's been a while.
Yeah.
Good to see you again.
Yeah.
Have I seen you before?
I don't think so. Well, I spoke to a few people on here, but I can't remember. People change their pictures all the time. So.
Yeah, it can definitely be a difficulty.
What was your background?
Discordian.
What's that?
I was usually a chaot, so chaos magician.
Oh, okay.
Chaos magic is a form of Western occultism.
Oh, chaos magic. Yeah.
Yeah. Chaos is often the identifier that chaos magicians will use to describe themselves.
Okay. Is that related to Thelema?
Closely related, though it's an offshoot that came about shortly after Thelema and sort of came to prominence in the late 70s, early 80s. And it's developed largely through the auspices of postmodern occultism. So a lot of post-Thelemic kind of things, modern forms of Thelemic, like Teutonian Order and things to that effect. Left-hand path orders like Order of Nine Angles and things to that effect have largely developed through the same current that chaos magic has gone through, which is often called an aeonic current, new aeon or post-modern occultism. So they're very much interrelated. The things that came after Thelema largely are very much motivated by and influenced by chaos magic and that path in general. One of the earliest groups that came out of it was the Temple of Psychic Youth, if you're at all interested in its early history. And it's quite interesting and fascinating how they actually sort of shot off from much earlier Thelemic things, and they're loosely associated with a figure called Osmond Spar, who is an artist also who was also an occultist, who came out of much earlier Thelemic and post Golden Dawn kind of era of things, and his very abstract and minimalist kind of theories and philosophies helped to inspire the aesthetic of chaos magic.
All right.
It's actually where they get the idea of a technique that they use called sigil magic. And they make abstract symbols as representations of specific magical formula and things like that. And that's one of the characteristic elements. If you were looking at it, something that stands out is their emphasis on sigils and sort of psycho-spiritual concepts it's replete throughout chaos magic writings. They take it much further than perhaps you might be familiar with neo-paganism and perhaps early Western occultism. Very radically, they think that belief systems are ultimately tools that can be utilized as a part of the magical tradition. So it's often called radical eclecticism for that reason.
Quite similar to.
Whenever
Yeah, sorry, go on.
whenever I'm asked to explain it, my mind just goes in like a million directions, and I don't even know where to start. So I've usually defaulted to having Kevin explain it.
You were about to say something, John?
And
No, I was just going to compare
yeah,
it
go
then
ahead.
to like the Rosicrucian tradition or the alchemical, where they just bring in loads of symbols and use them for transformation, that kind of thing. Just like
It's
an
a,
eclectic thing, yeah.
well, it's interesting you say that because that echoes back to the very earliest sort of things that fertilized the Western esoteric tradition. Hermeticism as a tradition coming out of the Hellenistic period was very syncretic, incorporating a variety of different things from different cultures. So when you see these modern forms of occultism largely coming out of after the Victorian period in Britain, that's echoing these very early Hermetic ideas from that time period of being mixing different things together into an overarching worldview where they're all supposed to be connected. And in the Renaissance, they were correlated to the Kabbalah, particularly the Christian Kabbalah, and you obviously see that quite a bit in Rosicrucianism, but it's definitely present quite a bit in Golden Dawn, which is sort of the grandfather of a lot of these modern occult traditions. So it's no surprise that something coming out of that current would be as radically eclectic as postmodern occultism and chaos magic.
I think an important factor with the use of symbols for me is that it attracts my mind. Like you don't use a set. I don't. Well, I can't speak for everyone, but I don't go for a set of symbols that's been predetermined or even for their predetermined uses necessarily, unless I feel that it works for me, unless it connects in my own mind. It has really no power. So it's that journey as symbols go.
Almost definitely, and looking at your tradition, I mean that's an overarching theme, a repeating theme within these discussions. You see a lot of that within not just Peter Carroll, but particularly Phil Hine, talking about a sort of modular spirituality that is ultimately adaptable. That any element that you include in pandemonium is yours to take as you wish and to do with as you wish. So the use of symbolism is no coincidence, because when you're talking of things like that, you're talking about memetics, a concept used often in psychology to discuss the relevance of symbols as shortcuts to getting to much larger and often more personal interpretations of interactions, relationships, and emotional understandings of certain concepts. I obviously come at from a different angle, from less from a personal perspective and more from taking a certain culture and personalizing a specific culture. But a lot of the things I've learned from studying these more postmodern traditions is the value of personalization. That ultimately you don't have a living spiritual path unless you're able to find the ways in which your personal interpretation connect with those traditions. And it's interesting to discuss that and how that idea is ultimately developed. And you have people like Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell, regardless if you're taking inspiration from these people, they were ultimately the trailblazers for discussions about these concepts in the first place. So I think it's valuable to look at that history and how things have developed since then. They sort of open the door for a lot of these explorations that you and I take advantage of. speaking honestly, I don't particularly agree with Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell. I often feel that some of the things they say are ultimately redundant or or overused in particular. I see a lot of overusage of Jung in particular. I've often taken to calling it a neo-Jungianism, this adapting Carl Jung's work out of context and using it as a go-to default to make any sort of explanation or interpretation that you see fit. And it gives a sort of pseudo credibility to a lot of discussions on subjects of mythology by giving it a sort of pseudo scientific credibility when the basis should not necessarily be through the auspices of science, but should be the auspices of culture. But that's speaking from my personal experience.
So you're saying that in the context of justification, or what exactly?
From the context of justification, using it as a catch-all term to justify anything without actually going into depth about it. It's a nice kind of dressing. It's almost like duct tape for a weird idea. I've seen people
Yeah,
use it quite a bit.
yeah, I see that a lot with people with young. It's like it's an excuse. You know, when people talk about their shadow self, and it's like you have to get in touch with your dark side. People often use that as an excuse to express that and express being something negative and putting it on a pedestal. That's just something I've witnessed.
Yeah, and a lot of the sort of self-entitlement that we see with modern culture is often used in that way. Um,
Yeah.
People don't want to actually look at themselves and have any sort of growth and critically examine themselves and how that makes sense within a spiritual tradition. They use it as an excuse, like you're saying.
Hmm.
It's so weird for me because, like, from my perspective and the way I am, I hardly ever feel a desire or a need to justify uh, what I want to do or what I believe. I just feel that uh, if that is my desire, then I do it, and if that's what I believe, that's what I believe. I don't even really feel I have much control over the matter. So, from my perspective, it's not even needed.
I think that's a good point. No matter what angle you're taking it from, whether it's very traditional, very modern, very eclectic, I think it's valuable to ultimately just describe how you see things and describe the traditions you practice without feeling the need for justification. But I feel a lot of people run this, they sort of ride the line between wanting everything to be justified, but also at the same time wanting to do whatever they want. So they use these sorts of philosophical duct tape to combine these two together when they realize that you can't really have two tigers on one mountain. Ultimately, at some point, you have to say, well, I'm going to do what I'm going to do. I'll find other people who do something similar, and we'll have discussions. We might have debates. But when you're trying to go on these very far extremes, oftentimes you have to bridge it with something for it to seem to make sense. But ultimately, it just sort of frays and falls apart under scrutiny. And I see that on a regular basis. And these are usually the people who get very offended when even the smallest bit of scrutiny is put in their direction. I think it's quite shameful.
Well, I feel as if a set of beliefs that someone holds, that the only time that you really need to justify anything is if you are either trying to, I don't know, for lack of a better word, win, or you're seeking to convert someone to your system of belief. And I don't really entirely desire to use my belief system to do either directly. So, I mean, for me, it would be a waste to go down that road.
Definitely, and that's a common thread, particularly under the auspices of alternative spirituality. So, I mean, you have a lot of people. I mean, we're not proselytizing in our belief systems, so it's not really a need. But you have people who sort of, in a sort of way, are focusing on a pop culture. They want mainstream acceptance within their own in-group, not necessarily as a whole, but within their own group. And an example of this you see, and we've discussed this on numerous occasions, the influence that Wicca has had in modern alternative spirituality, wanting to be this sort of default for people. And I find oftentimes, particularly, various authors who are trying to make money with constant book publishing, that they're ultimately exploiting people who are very new to these different things. And instead of opening them up to different things that they can explore, giving them resources from which to do so, they're trying to tell people how to think. And I think that's antithetical to what we do as a whole. It's a part of the reason why you have people in the pagan community who will use things like the Silver and Raven Wolf school of Wicca. They take a book from Barnes and Noble that's very neo, very kind of bland, doesn't really give a lot of material or things to explore, but sort of caters to a person's ego and actually ends up stifling their growth later on down the line.
I feel that happens with some more mainstream religions as well, because just by the being a mainstream religion, you're kind of a default religion or whatever the dominant religion in a country is, and that it stifles growth.
And that's why when you walk into a modern bookstore, in a lot of cases, you'll see things like Joel Osteen. And you want to talk about somebody who manipulates people on the basis of religion, there you go.
Well, the most he does is make people feel good and then just cite maybe one or two verses to try and justify what he's saying. And then sells a book about how to improve your life, or some happy, make you feel good advice.
If you ever want to feel depressed about society, walk into the self-help section of a bookstore. Like try to stay there for 5 minutes and just look at things, and you'll realize how much of a dead end that sort of aspect is. A lot of times I find they just repeat things that you should already probably know, like get sunlight, interact with other people, eat okay, do things to declutter your life, de-stress yourself. And the sad thing is there are people who don't know to do that they need a book that they spend $12.95 to buy to tell them these things, that they've got to that point in their life.
That's just assuming they only buy one instead of a couple.
Yeah, agreed.
Have you seen this Joe? Is it Joe Osteen? I don't know how to pronounce his name, but it's like the big mega churches in Texas and that. It's like,
Yeah.
I mean, they fill up a church the size of Wembley Stadium to be read the Bible to. I just think that's a bit over the top.
Yeah, it's definitely demagoguery.
But I think it's just, like people taking advantage of people's need for, rather than looking within and finding these symbols and things that but a lot of people here use as ways of transforming yourself. They look outside of themselves for help, and then they get taken advantage of by predators.
Agreed. I mean, and I've mentioned this before. I mean, even though I'm obviously not Christian, I have absolutely no problems with people going through a proper Bible study, where they're actually looking at verses and looking at various different interpretations and looking into the history, even if their conclusions are not what I would necessarily come to about those histories. At least it's a more thorough examination. So, John, have you read anything interesting of late?
I haven't been doing much lately. Really, been too busy.
Understood.
Yeah.
A lot has happened kind of in terms of spirituality of late. So I thought I might give you the Cliff Notes version.
Say it again, sir.
I said a lot has happened with spirituality for me lately, and I figured I'd give you a little of what's happened.
Okay.
Very recently, I ended up getting involved with the Unitarian Universalist Church. Are you familiar with them?
No, I've heard of it.
They're more stateside. I think there might be some overlap into other places, but it's mostly in the United States. Unitarian Universalist Church is ultimately coming from a Unitarian base within Christianity and ultimately universalism. And I mean, the term is actually used specifically from the Christian context, but as they've developed over the last couple of decades, they've become an interfaith organization. And in their main congregation, they have people from all around. It tends to be more people from specific traditions who are more progressive in their orientation. But there's Christians, Hindus, Muslims. You have quite a few Buddhists, and there's also an inclusion of people from non-theistic backgrounds, from agnostic backgrounds, atheistic backgrounds. So they try to give a more general kind of congregation for people from different traditions, and they do a lot of workshops, a lot of discussions, and things of the like. And they have their own credo, they have their own general principles that they follow. So it's actually quite an interesting organization. They also have a side group, an offshoot of UU called CUPS, and it's the Covenant of Unitarian Universalist Pagans. So they give a space for specifically pagan or centered alternative religion to be able to practice and to be able to congregate. And that's what I ended up getting involved with.
All right. When did you get involved with that?
About
Is
2
that
months ago.
recent? Okay.
Yeah, very recent. So I ended up socializing with a lot of them, going to their more general social events, potlucks, things like that, though I have been to a number of discussions, and I let them know what I practice. A number of them, very similar to the rest of the congregation, tend to be more on the eclectic side, tend to be on the more generic side of things. Their paths are generally less well-defined. So coming at it from a person who takes from a more specific tradition was a bit difficult at first. And not because there was any necessary discrimination on their part, but more because they didn't know what it was. But I got to a point of general understanding, and they became very interested in what I was doing. So they invited me to host something. So on the 14th of this month, I actually hosted a Panathenaea Tamikra, which is the lesser Panathenaea from the Athenian calendar, kind of the Greek New Year, affiliated with Athena specifically. There used to be games, and it was actually a very large festival in ancient times, but I condensed it, reduced it to a rather small kind of event. But we ended up having quite a few people. I was quite surprised, and a lot of people were very impressed with how I did things. And overnight, just by demonstrating it, a lot of people came to an understanding they would not have had otherwise.
All right. So, how does that work then with everybody having like, you just all bring your ideas to the table, and there's no bit like fraternities where or like the original Freemasons used to be. You just bring in your you can have any belief you want, as opposed to a more dogmatic type congregation.
Well, it's less specific. It's often called generic pagan in focus. So they tend to hold something, and it's a trope that you see throughout the rest of the pagan community. It's something called an open circle. Sometimes it's hosted with a specific tradition in mind, and you have people who experiment with it. They see how it is. They get to see something presented differently. But they take a bit more of a radical model for most of their things. They have a very generic and archetypal representation of the rituals, so it's very adaptable to most of the people who would typically attend, who tend to be eclectics. Though there are a number of traditionalists there in the congregation who I've met. So it's definitely an open environment, and I was very surprised. My previous experiences with the larger community have not been all that favorable, but I was met with a lot of openness, and not in a sort of subtly condescending, passive-aggressive sense. They actually genuinely wanted to see something different, hence why they asked me to host. So it's all ultimately used by a lot of people who attend as a networking device. You go there, you attend, you make friends there, and if you have a group of your own, you're starting something, you'd like to gather people for a certain workshop. Obviously, they don't want people proselytizing or advertising services or anything, but if you have a group that you're forming, it's a great place to meet people who might be interested and garner interest that way. That's largely how a lot of people use it.
Hmm. That sounds good.
Yeah, and it's helped a few things along. I've managed to meet a few people through it, some of which who have actually taken interest specifically in what I do. But also, I've managed to help out a lot of other people who practice things differently. I also help to host a discussion group outside of that. And I've met a few people through that who live very locally to a few of my close friends who practice Norse heathenry. So over the last couple of months, I've been able to gather them together, get them in communication online, and they've actually been able to plan and host a few things. So my hope is on my end, specifically for my tradition, to get a few people gathered, hopefully 4 or 5, maybe 6 people, to explore this, to study this, to discuss this, and actually host rituals at some point. That's the goal. So, and thus far, through some of these affiliated resources, associated resources, I've been able to gather interest and start things. But ultimately, a lot of this relies on online interaction because that's how you really get attention of people who are from different places who would otherwise not know you that you existed.
Yeah. Have you got many? How many would you need for a ritual?
Well, honestly, it wouldn't need. I would not need very many. Just a handful of people. My goal, at least for the year, is to have 4 or 5 people involved. I mean, as little as 3 or 4 would be good. I'd be happy with that. I have some friends that live further out in Southern California and Los Angeles, and they've been hosting a group. Though their focus is a bit more of an official kind of organization, and they're much more involved with larger groups.
Hmm.
Living out here, it's more rural or ex-urban, sometimes it's called. So the focus would be much more local, more intimate, more private, which, all things considered, is probably a better thing, anyways, because you could have much more one-on-one conversations with people, and you can customize things based on the people that are involved. So basically, I wouldn't want any more than 8 or 9 people at the end of it, because coordinating all of those people together to meet a few times a year would it starts to get a little on the difficult side without anything sort of tangible. We would likely be meeting in open spaces, public spaces, parks, things like that.
Yeah.
Welcome, Jonathan.
Yeah, I've been involved with a group myself for uh, probably about 6 months. Well, actually about a year, but I've not been going regular. So, but have you heard of the Samael and War?
Yes, I have.
Yeah, just started getting involved with a group, the Gnostic Cultural Association, Birmingham. It's quite interesting. It's helped me a lot. Um,
They have a rather different focus than a lot of what we've considered very traditional Gnostic groups who have tried to do more of an ecclesiastical focus. Obviously, I think I've mentioned this a few times. You have with uh, Bishop Stephen Holler. That's his focus. He's almost going from a Reconstructionist model, trying to recreate a sort of Gnostic church. But a lot of these other groups have more of a sort of a meetup style. You have people gathered together in a more loose confederation or fellowship. So
Yeah.
those can actually be pretty beneficial. A lot of them tend to host meditation groups and things similar, and I've seen similar analogs here in the States. So I'm glad you have found some people who are of similar mind.
Hmm. Yeah. So, are you familiar with like the second chamber and the third chamber and what that involves, that kind of thing?
No, I'm not that familiar with it.
All right.
I've heard those terms used once or twice, but I haven't really studied that particularly in depth.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've been invited to the second chamber anyway, but I just want to get more information about it first and keep going. And it's good to just meet up with people and share views, but it's very focused as opposed to what you were saying, where everybody's got their own separate views. They bring it to the table. This is very much, it's like keeping you on track, and it's all focused around uh, acknowledging the higher self as opposed to the ego self and that kind of thing. So,
Well, that typically happens when you get into something very ceremonial and focus. Is you have people going through certain paces. It's initiatory in focus. So you have people going through certain steps. So like you said, you're going to research it, and that's a good thing to do because from what I can tell from people who've been involved, it's a big commitment to get involved in it.
yeah. Well, that's what they said. Go away and take your time, think about it, because the commitment is not to the church, it's not to anybody outside. It's to your higher self. Call it the Atman, which is like the inner self. And your commitment is to that. And once you make the commitment, it's it's only you only it's up to yourself then. So yeah, I'm not quite ready to commit to that level because it's just getting used to giving up attachments and things and the full self, and little by little.
Gotcha.
Are you just out of interest? Do you know how Samael relates to like Thelema and Crowley's work? Are they? Do you know if they were? Obviously, they influenced. I mean, Crowley influenced Samael, I think, but I'm not sure how. Are they like an offshoot of that group or?
I don't believe so. I think that Samuel's focus, it was more Gnostic in the general sense of it, that it was more revelational in character, and that he started the group through what he experienced in that, and then formed a group around it.
Yeah.
But that follows a similar trope with a lot of esoteric orders, that you end up having kind of a founder, and then you have people who are part of the earlier core group, and then from there you have different leadership and different focuses, and people move it along different paths. And you have that with theosophy. It's really a common one. And actually, there's quite a bit of similarities between those two traditions. In
Oh
fact,
yes, yes, very theosophical. Yeah.
yeah, and you have similar ideas with liberal Catholics, which incorporate, they're sort of Gnostic in the little g sense of it, and they often
Who's that?
liberal Catholic. It's
Oh.
it has to do with Utrecht Union. It's quite complicated. They're basically non-recognized Catholics that kind of went way off in the deep end in a totally different direction. There's also Old Catholic, which is a little closer to earlier Vatican Council Catholicism. Is much closer to that, but both of those groups tend to be much more progressive. They take views that are often not held by mainstream Christianity, but liberal Catholic in particular, it's very, very common for them to actually incorporate full-on theosophical tenets into their
Would that
views.
be Gnostica, Catholica,
Well,
theological?
they wouldn't be considered Gnostic. They don't actually hold to Gnostic worldviews, the sort of demiurge or anything like that. So they would be affiliated in some way or influenced by Gnostic concepts, but very, very lightly.
Yeah, because I
They're more
mean,
congregational.
Crowley's was what he set up was the Gnostica Catholica Theologica. Can't pronounce it exactly, but it wasn't he trying to combine the two, and he kind of just looked at, well, Catholic just means universal, so, and thelema meaning will, and Gnostic meaning to know. So he just tried to combine these elements and create a church out of that.
Yeah, he that's the ecclesiastical side of Thelema.
That's the
And
word,
people,
yeah.
yeah, the people who ecclesia meaning church.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
so there's different ways that you can kind of approach that, and oftentimes the when you're looking at Thelema as a tradition, you start attending, that's where they go. That's the main like almost congregation involved in Thelema, and then their more specific work is outside of that. Oftentimes personally, at home, through study, things like that.
Hmm.
But there's all sorts of different Thelema groups that can get rather complicated.
Yeah. Do you think? What do you think? Do you think it's helpful being part of a group, or do you think it's better to, I mean, do you think it makes any difference, or to the overall goal?
Yeah, I think so, and particularly the case with alternative spirituality because there's such a lack of people, and a lot of us find ourselves being involved in online groups and correspondences, video conferencing, things like that. So we can have other people to bounce ideas off of. If it's just you and your study, oftentimes you get to a certain point where you could really use the benefit of other people's experiences, the benefit
Yeah.
of other people's resources, and everyone has different tendencies, things that they're better at, things that they're worse at, different levels of understanding. So having a group allows you to have a more comprehensive understanding of things. And obviously, that's the goal of a lot of groups is ultimately to have some kind of physical group, whether it's just you and your buddies meeting in a house or an official kind of like group. But ultimately, a lot of that comes down to logistics, what you actually have available to you. And at some point, depending on how much that's important to your path, you ultimately have to make certain concessions. But there's nothing to say that you couldn't be involved in multiple groups. A lot of people are. I know that in Holder's group there was a number of Thelemites who found their way into that congregation and were involved either loosely or officially with that congregation. So there's definitely a precedent for doing that.
Hmm.
Atarhasi's, it's complicated. You could say that they're dualist Gnostics, but that's kind of not reflective of that worldview. The demiurge is a lesser entity that comes out of the oneness, so it's not literally a duality in that sense of it. Though if you're looking at Zoroastrian religion, it's often called dualist for the simple fact that there's a tendency to focus on duality. But it's often, particularly in Gnostic belief, the demiurge, the demiurgos or Yaldabaoth, is considered a lesser being. In many cosmologies, it was a creation of Sophia after she fell from the oneness. It was Sophia, and along with various other entities were considered aeons. There were also things called archons, which were sort of negative aeons in a certain sense, very much in the way that you would see angels and demons in early Catholic theology. But it's interesting you're looking at the Demiurgos in Gnostic belief compared to how it was viewed in Neoplatonism. In Neoplatonism, the Demiurgos was a reflection of the one that was less pure than the one, but not necessarily evil. But in Gnosticism, the Demiurgos is often considered incompetent or full-on evil. Depending on the tradition, there's a sort of variance in how the Demiurge is personified, but the general theme is that he's sort of like a devil type figure, a lesser deity that's often correlated with the God of the Old Testament in a lot of traditions. You see echoes of these concepts in Marcion, who wanted to completely do away with the Old Testament altogether.
There's a lot of confusion about the demiurge. I mean, there's different concepts of it. I mean, like Origen, early Greek church father, used a lot of Neoplatonism. He said that the demiurge was Christ, Christ being the Word. So the Gnostics misunderstood, thinking that the Word was.
Looks like we're having some strange connection issues. A few times, a few people have cut out when they were saying things. Could you repeat some of what you said, John? You're saying that Origen took a more Neoplatonic view of the demiurge being corollary to the Logos. Logos.
I can contribute and say that it wasn't just them. You had a lot of the mystics, especially during the Radical Reformation. People who followed Jacob Burma and the Schwarzenau Brethren and things like that. They sometimes, especially Beisel, I think I've talked about him before. I mean, his idea of the demiurge was identifying him with Christ. So it was very interesting.
Oh yeah. And it's a reflection of a lot of these early ideas that you have at the time. There's similar ideas in Neoplatonism as there are in Hermeticism, and a lot of different mystery cults from the mystery period. So, but that continued for centuries afterwards. And I think I mentioned once or twice the Cathars in France. They were a late Middle Ages kind of Gnostic group, and they actually went out and said that the god of the church at the time was the devil. I mean, they took it to a much more extreme of the demiurge concept of being evil. And they didn't even use the demiurgos as a term; they just called him the devil. It's kind of interesting because their group was very specialized, very isolated, and extremely ascetic. And maybe in some ways that contributed to their downfall. But the church felt threatened by them and exterminated them. It was called the Albigensis Crusade on the Cathars. They were in southern France.
I got you. I'm trying to think. I think the last work of Martin Luther was titled something like like the papacy, the devil's foundation, or something like that.
That doesn't surprise me. I mean, there was a lot of hostility towards the church for a long time, and it really wasn't until later on, as the centuries went forward, particularly as you started entering towards the Renaissance, that people were able to vocalize some of these complaints, some of these criticisms of what the church was doing. So, Jonathan, what have you been up to lately?
I've been dealing with my father died about 3 weeks ago, and so there's been a lot of things that have been happening as a result of that. So that's really taken up a lot of my time. Um, in addition to that, I've been arguing on Facebook with people and starting a new job, um, which it's all right. It's still not exactly where I want to be, but got to do what you got to do.
Yeah, you got to pay the bills.
That's exactly right. So yeah, there's just a lot of different stuff going on. So
Gotcha. Well, I send my condolences for your father's passing. I've had personal experience with the death of a parent. It's not easy.
oh, thank you. I appreciate that very much. See, you've gotten a new microphone. It sounds much better than the old one.
Yeah, this is it's a full-on dynamic mic with a XLR cable, and it's a cardioid. So there's advantages and disadvantages to it. But I have it hooked up to my computer using a USB, an XLR to USB cable. And I also have an XLR cable extension, so I could move this around the room if necessary. The advantage of the cardioid mic, because it's noise cancellation, is that external noise is almost non-existent. I mean, I have the air conditioning on; it's very quiet by comparison to my other mic. The disadvantage is that you really have to talk up close to it. The closer you get, the louder the voice. It's much more uh, pronounced the closer you get to the microphone. So there's a little few bits of tweaking. Sometimes you have to reinstall drivers, but once you get it working, it works out quite well. And it's much better for recording. Though the sound is a lot less warm than some of the USB mics. So there's definitely some differences I've noticed, but and you're always going to get background static with a lot of mics, but um, it's really good in post edit if you're making videos or doing podcast recordings. It's very easy to, I mean, the amount of noise reduction even necessary to clean up the vocals is very small in comparison to a very cheap USB mic.
Gotcha.
And it wasn't too bad. It's a Behringer XM 8500. I got it for about $20. Not too bad for a budget mic.
Can't complain about that, man. That's great.
And cables are really inexpensive online. You can get them much less expensive than you can at a music store. What I always tell people is read reviews, particularly if you're trying to figure out if it'll work. A lot of people will put in information about how it's worked or not worked on their computer with this setting or that setting. So there's little things that you can kind of do to make sure it'll work. Always do your research in advance.
Gotcha. I guess other than that, I mean, Monday nights I'm usually at small group. We're doing A.W. Tozer, The Pursuit of God. Pursuit of God is interesting because it's one of the most mystical works, and one of the most recent mystical works that um, I would say Orthodox Protestant Christians have sort of embraced, which is pretty neat. It's not often that they sort of come around to forms of mysticism. And I think it has something to do with the fact that Tozer is very deep in terms of his theological conviction. So it's a neat study. I mean, I've read through Pursuit of God before for a university class, but this is an interesting take on it.
Oh, good. I'm glad. It's always good to have study groups.
So I think maybe an appropriate question for this group would be, to what extent do you think that faith will play as a role in this election? I think, given current events, I think it's going to play the least role as that it has ever in American history.
Well, it seems a lot of the old tropes are still continuing, particularly as a sort of the view that the Republican Party, at least in the states here, is representative of the rights of Christians, and sort of freedom of religion versus a lot of the sort of Democratic Party representing more of a secular kind of focus, and often in an antithetical relationship to the Republican Party. But there is something to be said about the fact that we're still going through a lot of wars in the Middle East, and a lot of them, a lot of the conflict overseas is religious in character, that regardless of how society as a whole is moving, in this current election, it might be something that's considered too controversial to discuss, and people might try to avoid it on both sides of the fence. So I would tend to agree with you that by the time we get to the election, right now we're kind of just vetting out different political candidates, and a lot of them are kind of making a show of it on both sides. Probably by the time we get to the election, and certain candidates will probably try to skirt the issue, if not full on avoid it. If for nothing else, on the positive, because we have other things that we probably should focus on: the deficit, uh, economic inequalities, things like that, need for reform in a lot of different programs, and obviously there's going to be discussions about ecological impact on certain industries and things like that. So, but
Yeah.
is it not gonna? Is there going to be? Is there not going to be any discussion that has anything to do with religion? I think that's a little uh, too much to expect. I think there will be some. They'll probably try to minimize it, if for nothing else, because of the controversy and because of the other things people would like to focus on. But I doubt that it'll be completely absent from the debates.
Well, I mean, one of the things that irks me, and I've said this in a few different places on Facebook, is how political figures co-opt religious language and religious groups for their own political gain. And, just sort of reflecting recently on President Obama and how he went out of his way to be interviewed by Rick Warren, who's a pretty famous evangelical preacher. I don't want to have anything to do with him, but other people do. And it was just a very, very interesting to me. I think you won't see that in this election. I don't think you'll see that same catering because I would say in the last 2 to 3 years, to be associated publicly with anyone who is overtly religious has become somewhat toxic to both Republicans and Democrats. Um, it tends to cause more problems than it could possibly solve.
The best example of that was Obama in 2008 when was the church he went to in Chicago. The Reverend was some videos popped up of him saying some controversial things about how America was basically doing bad things abroad and they were paying the consequences for it. And that came out and blew up in Obama's face like in July of the election 2008. And since then, he hasn't really been attached to any controversial religious figures except for uh, the one he just mentioned in 2012.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right.
And if anything, the importance of religion, at least in the election, will be more on Republicans, since they have to cater to more to the religious wing of their party to get the nomination. Plus, there's now a pretty interesting, not really interesting, but there's a shift, at least in the gay marriage issue, that now it's about not about equality, but about religious freedom for people or in businesses. There'll be probably a little bit more emphasis on that for the elections. Or like if a candidate believes in religious freedom and to what extent, that'd be, I think, the most discussed part religiously in the general election.
Yeah, I don't know. It seems to me that in any election, economic affairs are going to drown out any religious language, and I think um, I don't know, the sort of rhetoric that I've seen coming out of this recent downturn in the economy with respect to China. I mean, I would say that people are clinging more to a sort of an American economic myth rather than an American religious myth, um, if you will.
Uh, what do you define as the American economic myth?
I guess it would something along the lines of you know, the American people are a very strong people, and the American economy is a very, these great men. Oh, look at the Rockefellers, the Fords, etc. Um, we're going to put China into the dust. We're going to put everybody into the dust, and we're going to be on top because we're just so dang good.
That's halftime.
But if it is halftime and they're doing really bad in the first half of the game, they might focus on that halftime.
That's why the last election, what's his name? Clint Eastwood did like this commercial about basically how everything was going down, but it's halftime, so we can just pick up our boots and go back to work.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I just think this rhetoric, we're going to pick ourselves up by our own bootstraps doesn't really pan out in the global economy, if you will.
Excuse me. No, but at least the economic situation has improved compared to what's almost 8 years ago. We've pretty much gone out from the ditch, getting out of there, but it could be worse.
Oh, I know. I'm not saying that it's as terrible as it could be. I mean, I actually think the economy here is rather good right now. I just I'm interested in this sort of relation between um, how Americans look at their their country. They look at their country within sometimes religious terms like that. Um, how our policy is sort of our savior, and I don't know. Maybe I guess the attitude that I run into more often than not is that like the Supreme Court is the moral authority of America, and the you know those who are bringing us our economic legislation. That is like divine providence, and we need to do great and good hardworking things so that um, you know economic success will follow through the hand of our good government, if you will.
That reminds me of Max Weber's Protestant ethic. No, was it Protestant? No, capitalism and the Protestant ethic. That sort of similar. That people would just put their efforts into their work since they wouldn't know if they were saved or not. So the best way to know if you'd be saved in the afterlife is if you would work hard in this life, and that's something that he would analyze within these Protestant countries. That if you look at the Protestant countries, they're more likely to be more industrious or hardworking because of that uncertainty.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, and I think what it produces is almost like a schizophrenic society.
I think that's a good thing. There's still somewhat optimism how things will end up in the States. At least here in Puerto Rico, it's kind of the opposite way. It's just either denial or just pessimism.
I've met a lot of people from Puerto Rico who, um, yeah, they pretty much give it. Well, the reason they're here is they gave up on Puerto Rico.
Yeah,
They gave up on the idea that anything could possibly be better down there because it is so dangerous.
and we just basically defaulted this month on everything. Nothing bad's happened so far, but we defaulted. There's no way you can pay the debt, which we have. And there's a severe drought, which makes things so much fun. To the point that people were actually hoping and praying that a hurricane would come over here. But apparently the hurricane found out that it was coming to Puerto Rico, got the press, and just went south. So no rain and more drought. It's like things going from bad to worse like every single month.
Yeah, I've always held that Puerto Rico should necessarily become a U.S. state. The population is already higher than 3 U.S. states as it is. Um, we held on to it as a territory and for a very long period of time, and I don't know. I feel I feel like we were unfair to like Hawaii, for example, where we actually dethroned a monarchy, where Puerto Rico, was a colony. We sort of gained I think it goes back to the Spanish-American War. Is that right?
Yeah. Um, Basically, the U.S. invaded in the war and pretty easily took over the island. In fact, maybe just 5 deaths. That's about it. There was like no one to defend the island. But there have been at least 3 referendums concerning the status, and none of them have ended up conclusive. The last one ended up with like, depending on on who you ask, 60% voting for statehood, and then others saying 45% or 30 something, high 30s, low 40s. And they basically went to Congress saying, "Hey, we got this referendum, do something about the status," and nothing happened. That was in 2012. There's supposed to be a federal plebiscite coming up, but nothing's been talked about it because every single one that's happened is without congressional approval. So even if, like, let's say, 80% would vote for statehood, nothing would happen because it's not a doesn't obligate the federal government to do anything.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I, I think it might have I'm sure money has something to do with it. I mean, the thing is there's a lot of benefits that come with statehood, that Puerto Rico isn't able to take part in. Um, and I mean, I think that's a bit of a problem.
Besides having representation in Congress, most people would be able to get more money from federal programs than what they get right now. So, for
Oh yeah,
example, I'm not sure how much the percentage is, but let's say, for example, from Social Security, they get 2/3 of what someone in the States would get, and things like that. And what's the other thing? The economic problems, I would say at least it's 75% our fault, 25 the U.S. as well, because mostly they would give us tax exemptions and would motivate companies to come over here and create an industry. But after the extensions left, they all after the extensions expired, all the companies left. We didn't come up with a backup plan at all, and the U.S. didn't kind of throw any help there either. That's not all gloom and doom. I mean, you guys have got it going for you compared to over here. It's the tale of two cities.
yeah. I mean, I was referring to Royman's comment.
And I personally, at least in the last plebiscite vote, I was like within the 3% that voted for independence. But yeah, the independence movement's basically dead here.
Yeah, yeah. Look, there's independence movements all over the place, and you know, the problem. I think the problem more than anything is the kind of people the fledgling independence movement attracts that turn off anybody who would possibly benefit an independent state from joining along. Um, the token broke college dropout independence radical. Um, I met one of these guys in Hawaii, and I'm like, this is exactly why you won't succeed. Um, every successful independence movement had the rich people on their side, um, and that's just a sad fact of life. Um, you're not going to attract the rich folk with the jobless radical college dropout. Sorry.
At least here, it used to be a very big movement back in the 30s and 40s, but with basically the federal government persecuting them and going after them, and then the local government following it, the movement kind of died out. And it's a bit funny at some points. For example, the current president of the party, Rubén Berríos, he won like 5 terms for Senate of accumulation. I think we got it. Basically, it's a Senate uh, seat that everybody in the island gets to vote for instead of just districts. He would win by landslides. But whenever he would run for governor, not even 5% would vote for him. So everybody was good. Like everybody would agree, like, oh, he's a great leader, great senator. Governor, no, he's just too radical for that. He can be in the legislature, but not in the executive mansion, just because. And there's just a lot of bipartisanship here. Uh, People vote for the parties more for the candidates. Just, I'd say worse than in the states, because here they just don't even think about the candidates. They don't even watch the debates. They don't even look at the policy proposals. They just vote under the symbol for their party and just vote for every single candidate there.
So, I mean, given the fact that the state is failing in its job, what do you see taking over the responsibilities of the Puerto Rican government? I mean, I always like to look at the Dark Ages because, in the midst of the political turmoil, the church really took over as the stabilizing force in society. And so I'm wondering, what's sort of taking over in Puerto Rico, if there's anything going on.
There are rumors that the federal government would like establish this committee of people that is basically be in charge of the island's finances. Just take that away from the government and just let a federal syndicate just take over the finances and structure the debt and pay off. But at least from the people, there's not really any type of movements or anything happening. Like normally, one would think that'd be like Greece, where people would be protesting about tax hikes, cutting public works benefits. but it's just really nothing happening from this side of the island. So everybody thinks either the federal government's going to step in, forgive the debt somehow, or allow us to declare bankruptcy, which neither have happened, or that they'll take over the debt. They'll set up a committee to pay over the debt and to establish the budgets and whatnot.
Or they could treat you like American Samoa, completely take away your citizenship, call yourselves nationals instead, and just sort of say, hey, whatever.
Yep. They could do that. Like they could just say like tomorrow, oh, we'll just give you independence just because, since it's a territory, the Congress can do whatever they want with it.
Well, that's typically their opinion. I mean, it's sort of gross, but Native Americans in this country don't fare any better.
That's why I think it's that there's one case, I think it's right now in the appeals court, that might just go to Supreme Court and see if they'll actually change the, not status, but at least the definition of it. Because the last time the Supreme Court talked about it, they determined that Puerto Rico was part of, not belonging to the states. And that case is at least 110 years old, and nothing else has happened since that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the big problems is the separation of government agencies. So you have like the Food and Drug, uh, um, oversight, and when companies try to, do different actions, sometimes they do things that are in violation of the regulatory authorities in the U.S., but because what they were doing is Puerto Rico, it fell under their jurisdiction, and the legal codes aren't exactly the same, and so there's a lot more stuff you can get away with in Puerto Rico that you can't get away with in the U.S., and there's been a lot of cases where companies have faced legal charges and the Supreme Court, etc. They had big hearings and things, and it's just caused havoc having these separate governmental entities.
I hear the problem is that the agencies are just largely inefficient at all, like completely inefficient. For example, the Department of Education here basically relies on federal funding to pay for programs. Like there's some programs that they can't pay for themselves without the federal government putting at least half or putting a part of it. And even though we spend a stupid amount of money on certain things, there's no results or anything positive to talk about them. We'd spend, I'd say, I'm not sure how much the figure was, but we spend a certain amount of money per student in the Department of Education, and the results are just dismal compared to everyone else in the island and everyone else in the country. And there was some agencies saying that the federal government was going to take away their funds because of corruption or just inefficiency. In this case, you might have a company doing something in the island that clearly violates federal laws, but nobody's going to enforce it because either they're inefficient or don't care about it. And then the federal agency has to come in and do something about it. For example, there's one case of corruption in the police department and violation of civil rights. Nobody did anything about it here. Federal government comes in, investigates, they find out all this conspiracy for corruption, briberies, and they actually do something about it. They arrest people, implement new regulations. But I say the problem is just mainly on this side, is people not really doing their jobs and enforcing the local laws for whatever reason. Because in theory, well, not in theory, we should have basically all the federal regulations except for one or two that are not compatible because of a law. But most of them will apply.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. That's really rough.
Yep, but let's see how long things will continue until they actually change. Because the current model doesn't work. It worked for a while. We had like 7, 8, 10% growth economically every year. Now it's just down to negative. So the model just ran out and nobody wants to do anything about it.
Yeah, I mean it's easy to organize, but it's hard to organize. Like one of the things I've noticed with social media is that it's really easy to get a mob. Something goes viral on Twitter, something goes viral on Facebook. Everybody's out there raising the alarm, whether the information is true or not. But in terms of sustained campaigns, I mean, I don't think there's ever been a weaker time. I don't know if it has something to do with people's attention spans being so low with the internet. It's probably what the answer is. It's just a lack of attention span. I don't know. Conditions aren't bad enough to cause everybody physical pain at the same moment.
Here they could work. Like there's a case of where social media worked to do two things. One, they wanted to pass a law here that basically said that you couldn't discriminate against gays and transsexual and transgender people in employment. And there was another one to apply legal protection to gay couples for domestic abuse. The domestic one didn't pass because of the public pressure, and the one about discriminating job passed in spite of all the public pressure they put. And everybody was organizing in social media. All the churches went against it. All the religious people went and marched. Everybody organized for that in like a week. They raised the sales tax to 11%, the highest in the country. Nobody went out to the streets. Nobody.
Oh my gosh.
And the second
I'm
go ahead. I was thinking about the second case that the social media helped something
no,
here.
go ahead.
The other one was they wanted to introduce basically gender perspective in education, basically saying that the books here, at least for when I was growing up, basically had like girls can do these jobs, boys can do these jobs, gender roles, and while teaching kids. So what they wanted to do was just eliminate that from education, basically saying, oh, you can do anything you want when you grow up, treat everyone equally, treat everyone nice. But what happened was someone decided to put on social media that they're going to use a book saying and teaching kids how to be gay and teaching them about sex starting when they were 5 years old. And then everybody went to the streets to protest it. And that bill just died before it even got introduced. Even though the Department of Education never presented the books, they never actually had anything proposed. Just that one rumor that some guy started just destroyed the whole thing. All the churches organized, all the parents went against it. It was a giant fiasco when that happened.
Yeah. It's the wonders of the information age. Oh, the accuracy of the information we get in the information age.
But when it comes to, for example, the drought that we have, just because we have very bad infrastructure, nobody went out to protest. Raise taxes, nobody protested.
Well, it's boring. It's not fun. It's not provocative. It doesn't carry your attention from the moment the headline grabs it. Giant cracks in bridge doesn't grab headlines like, school forces 5-year-olds to learn about gay sex. They're just not going to grab the same amount of attention, and that applies to a whole lot of things. I mean, the people who I think want to affect the most real and lasting change are the people who are talked over the most, because they're just the things that they campaign for just aren't sexy enough.
Yeah. So that's why nothing here will, well, nothing, but change will come very slowly here until basically it's just right at the end. Either change comes from the U.S. or change doesn't come at all. I mean, even here, the Supreme Court had a case about gay marriage before the federal one, and they basically said no to gay marriage. I think we were the only one that actually had a case go to the Supreme Court, state-wise or local-wise, and had them say no, compared to how it happened in the States. Usually every other state was saying yes, gay marriage, or the legislatures that passed it. Here, just if it wasn't for the U.S. government, gay marriage would still be illegal.
Yeah.
And after that, they want to change the civil code to actually include gay marriage, even though it's already legal and allowed. People are against it already, even though it's just to change one thing that has no effect to how the law is. So even though it's legal, they'll probably not never include it in the civil code here, saying that homosexuals can get married, even though they can by the federal court decision.
Yeah, it's a tough predicament. Or, I have hang-ups about gay marriage myself, so I never supported it.
Why didn't you support it, or why don't you?
Because the uh, marriage ceremony is, I believe, a religious ceremony, and I would prefer that the courts and the state use the word civil unions, and I would definitely want legal protections on churches and other groups who don't recognize um, gay marriage to not be forced to perform, you know, a marriage ceremony. I think that civil union should take place because I think that people who are, homosexually oriented should be afforded the same legal protections as married couples. I have no problem with that. It's strictly the religious terminology that is being used by the legislation that I disagree with.
Let's just have a semantic problem with it. Just change the name and that's about it. Like you have no problem with the government recognizing the gay union or lesbian union.
Yeah, that's pretty much what it comes down to. I mean, and that's why, and I don't think a lot of people recognize or understand this. I mean, that's why making a cake for a gay wedding is so offensive, because you're contributing to a marriage ceremony that you see as heinous. Um, I think, and I think it has something to do. We're not very careful about the language that we use when we're talking about things, and I don't think that a lot of homosexuals, are, you know, going going toward a religious mindedness when they're thinking about becoming, partners living together. They're really thinking about, I should be afforded the same legal protections as, Tom and Sally over there. All right, well, I have to sign off for the night. It was very nice talking to you, Cornelius and Kevin and Roven.
You
Hope you
too.
guys have a great night.
Night.